December 12, 1864. A crisp winter night in Charleston, South Carolina, draped the city in fog and lamplight. The streets, usually alive with horse hooves and merchants, were eerily quiet. But inside the grand halls of the Duval Plantation, the air was thick with perfume, candle wax, and the sharp edge of tension no one dared name aloud. Abigail Carter, a seamstress of 23, moved quietly among the guests. Her hands, skilled and precise from years of stitching silks and satins, trembled slightly, not from fear, but from calculation. Every fold of fabric, every pleat, every ribbon she had tied on the ballroom gowns of Charleston's elite had taught her patience, and patience, tonight, was all she needed. The Duval family was one of the wealthiest in the city. Charles Duval, the master of the house, was known for his charm. But behind the polished veneer lay a man of cruelty, sharp words, and sharper discipline. His wife, Eleanor, floated beside him like a doll, draped in pearls and silence, eyes that saw and said nothing. Abigail's life had been measured in stitches, orders, and quiet obedience. She had learned the hard way that the smallest error could lead to punishment. The faintest misstep could break bones or spirit. But she had a secret, one that had grown slowly in the shadows of the Duval mansion, a secret shaped by injustice, betrayal, and the desperate hope for freedom. As the chandeliers sparkled above, Abigail's mind wandered back to the days she first arrived at Duval Plantation. She had been only 14, a girl with bright eyes and nimble fingers, sold into servitude after her family's farm was seized in the aftermath of a debt dispute. The Duvals had taken her in, not out of kindness, but because skilled hands were profitable. The years had been a lesson in survival. She learned to smile when struck, to nod when belittled, to pretend ignorance when she understood every cruel word. Every stitch she sewed into a ball gown was a mark of her endurance, a silent rebellion woven into fabric no one would ever notice. But that night, something inside Abigail shifted. The Duvals' arrogance had grown unbearable. Rumors spread that Charles Duval had been exploiting other servants, that punishments had become more violent, that his debts to his own creditors would one day bring ruin, and he would bring ruin to anyone in his path. Abigail had heard whispers hidden in the servant corridors, tales of poisonings, strange illnesses, and unexplained deaths in the households of Charleston's elite. The plan, which had been forming quietly in her mind for months, was now ready. A single mistake by the Duval master could lead to his downfall, but Abigail had no intention of leaving it to chance. Her preparation had been meticulous, the right moment, the right guests, the perfect opportunity. She had spent weeks learning which glasses Charles preferred, which wines he favored, which foods would mask the taste of her carefully concocted solution. As the evening progressed, the ballroom filled with laughter, music, and the clinking of crystal glasses. Couples twirled across the polished floor, oblivious to the tension brewing in the shadows. Abigail moved among them like a ghost, unnoticed, her eyes fixed on her target. Each step was measured, each breath controlled. She remembered every injustice, every insult, every harsh word that had shaped the woman she had become. Somewhere in the midst of the music, she saw him, Charles Duval, laughing too loudly, leaning too close to Eleanor, his hand brushing a young debutante in a way that made her stomach churn. Abigail's pulse quickened. It wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming a piece of herself stolen long ago, about turning the tables on the man who had made her life a lesson in fear. She glanced around at the guests. Men in tailored coats, women in silk and velvet, all playing the roles expected of them. No one would suspect the seamstress, the quiet girl behind the curtains, the one whose life had been dictated by the whims of masters. Yet tonight the balance would shift. The Duval mansion, with its polished floors and golden chandeliers, would witness a reckoning it could not foresee. Abigail moved toward the dining table, where the wine glasses glimmered in the lamplight. Her fingers brushed over the polished silver, her heart steady despite the storm of adrenaline. She knew the risk. If caught, she would face execution, but she also knew the truth. Some injustices were too great to ignore, some oppressions too deep to endure silently. Her mind flashed to the people she had met in the servant quarters. Young girls terrified of their masters, old men broken by decades of labor, children who had never known freedom. Abigail wasn't acting for herself, alone. She was acting for every voice silenced in the halls of Charleston's plantations. Tonight, the air of celebration would mask the bitter truth of betrayal. Every laugh, every toast, every waltz step would bring her closer to the moment she had been waiting for. And when it came, the consequences would ripple far beyond the Duval mansion, reaching into the hearts of a society that had never before witnessed such audacity from someone considered powerless. Abigail paused near the grand staircase, the gleaming staircase that had seen decades of obedience and submission. She inhaled, the scent of wax and wine filling her lungs. In that instant, she became more than a seamstress. She became a force shaped by grief, patience, and quiet fury. A force that would not be ignored. The orchestra swelled, the chandelier, lights danced across the polished floor, and Abigail stepped forward, every movement precise, every intention clear. The Duval master, so confident in his power, remained unaware that the night he celebrated would mark the beginning of his undoing. And so, as the clock ticked toward midnight, Abigail Carter, the seamstress, prepared to turn the tables in a way no one in Charleston or history would forget. The candlelight flickered against the gilded walls of the Duval mansion as Abigail moved with silent precision. Every detail mattered: the angle of a glass, the weight of a plate, the subtle tilt of a chair. She had memorized every inch of the ballroom and the adjoining dining hall, every servant's schedule, and the habits of the Duval family. Months of observation had brought her to this night, and failure was not an option. Charles Duval, oblivious to the storm approaching, mingled with guests in grand gestures, laughter spilling from him like spilled wine. To the untrained eye, he was the embodiment of wealth and charm. But Abigail had seen the cracks behind the facade, the arrogance, the cruelty hidden in polite smiles, the way he thrived on the fear of those around him. Every insult he had ever thrown, every punishment he had meted out, every whispered fear she had heard in the servant quarters, all of it had built toward this single moment. The Duvals were pillars of Charleston society, a family whose influence reached far beyond their opulent home. Yet their power depended on the unseen hands of people like Abigail, women who stitched their clothes, polished their silver, and remained invisible in every grand portrait and ceremony, and Abigail had remained invisible for too long. Kailasior. Servant quarters, life had been a careful dance of obedience and secrecy. Abigail had learned the nuances of survival there, the soft footfalls, the whispered warnings, the coded glances that conveyed danger without words. She remembered the stories the older women told, tales of other servants who had tried to resist and paid with broken bodies or worse. But she had also learned from them the possibilities of patience, of planning, of small, precise acts that could topple the mighty without them ever suspecting. Tonight, Abigail's plan would finally unfold. She had spent weeks preparing the poison, consulting old texts she had found hidden in the mansion library, learning the effects and dosages that would incapacitate quickly and silently. She had tested her mixture on scraps of food discarded in the kitchen, noting its odorless, tasteless properties. Every step was measured, every precaution was taken. She knew that even the slightest miscalculation could mean discovery and death. As the evening progressed, the music swelled and the guests' laughter filled the air with false security. The ball was meant to celebrate wealth, status, and appearances, but to Abigail it was a stage, and everyone present was an unwitting actor in her meticulously crafted play. She moved among them, her hands steady, her mind sharp, counting the moments, timing her steps with precision. Abigail's thoughts drifted briefly to her own past, to the life she had been denied. Her parents had been farmers, hard-working and honest, until a combination of debt, misfortune, and predatory creditors had taken everything. She had been sold into servitude, separated from her siblings, forced to labor in the homes of strangers who valued her hands but not her heart. Over the years, she had seen countless injustices, endured humiliations, and watched the powerful thrive on fear and control. Every stitch she had sewn in gowns for the Charleston elite carried the weight of those memories. She had learned to conceal her intelligence, to appear compliant, to let the world underestimate her. But that underestimated quality had become her greatest advantage. No one suspected the quiet seamstress who moved through the shadows, observing, remembering, and planning. By now, the wine had loosened the tongues of the guests, the laughter growing louder, and Charles Duval more confident with each passing hour. Abigail noted his favored glass of Bordeaux, polished by his personal butler earlier that day, the way he gestured while speaking, the tilt of his head when amused. Everything had been memorized, every routine accounted for. She glanced around the ballroom at the other guests, men and women of wealth, privilege, and ignorance, unaware that the balance of power had shifted under their feet. Abigail felt a thrill, not of cruelty, but of justice long delayed. The tiny details she had noticed over months, an impatient glance, a careless gesture, a repeated pattern, were now part of a larger design. Her attention returned to the Duval family. Eleanor, the wife, floated near Charles, her smile polite but eyes sharp. She was a woman who had learned the art of survival in her own way, but tonight she would witness events beyond her comprehension. And Charles, laughing and grand, remained, blissfully unaware that his entire world was about to tilt. Abigail's eyes scanned the room, noting the positions of the other servants. The kitchen staff moved efficiently, unaware that the poison had already been prepared and hidden, ready to be placed in the correct vessel at the precise moment. Timing was everything, and Abigail's meticulous planning had left nothing to chance. As the evening drew on, she moved toward the grand dining table, where the food was displayed with opulent elegance. Her hands, skilled from years of sewing, now worked with a different purpose. She positioned the vial carefully, hidden within a decanter of wine, her pulse steady despite the adrenaline that surged beneath her calm exterior. She recalled the whispered conversations she had overheard. Among the Duvals and their associates, talk of wealth, property, and domination. Talk that had never considered the humanity of those who served them. Abigail had absorbed every word, every nuance, and now it fueled her resolve. Tonight was the culmination of years of quiet suffering, observation, and preparation. Outside, the Charleston night pressed against the windows, fog rolling over cobblestones, masking the mansion in a soft gray shroud. Inside, the music, laughter, and clinking glasses provided a deceptive soundtrack. No one suspected the tension lurking just beneath the surface, the quiet seamstress moving among them like a shadow, poised to alter the course of the evening. Irrevocably. Abigail paused briefly near the staircase, taking a moment to steady herself. She thought of the others she represented, the silenced, the oppressed, the invisible hands and voices that had been ignored for too long. She drew strength from their collective suffering, transforming it into calm determination. Tonight, her actions would speak louder than centuries of silence. The first hints of midnight approached, and with them, the final pieces of her plan were set into motion. Every element aligned: the placement of the wine, the distribution of the guests, the timing of distractions. Abigail Carter, once a quiet seamstress, had become a conductor orchestrating a symphony of justice in a mansion blind to its own fragility. And as the clock ticked ever closer to the decisive moment, Abigail felt the familiar calm that comes from total preparation. Her heart beat in rhythm with the plan she had so carefully designed, and she knew that once initiated, there would be no turning back. The Duval ball continued around her, oblivious to the storm that had gathered in plain sight. Every laugh, every toast, every note of music was part of the stage she had set. And when the time came, the quiet seamstress would reveal the truth hidden behind the gilded walls, a truth that would shock Charleston to its core. The grand clock in the Duval mansion struck 12, its chime echoing through the marble halls like an omen. Abigail Carter's heart did not falter. Years of observation, meticulous preparation, and silent suffering had led to this very moment. Tonight, the invisible hand of a servant would change the course of a family's history. Abigail moved through the ballroom with calm precision, a shadow among the glittering gowns and polished shoes. Each step was deliberate, each gesture unassuming. She approached the grand dining table where Charles Duval had already raised his glass to toast the gathered guests. The wine shimmered red in the candlelight, a silent accomplice to her plan. The other servants scurried about with trays of hors d'oeuvres and glasses of champagne, unaware that one of them carried the fate of the household within a simple decanter. Abigail's fingers brushed the delicate glass, the poison she had spent weeks perfecting concealed in its depths. She paused only briefly, scanning the room, ensuring no eyes could betray her actions. Timing was everything. One misstep could unravel months of careful plotting. As Charles lifted the wine to his lips, Abigail's mind wandered briefly to his character. To the world, he was the embodiment of power and charm, a man whose wealth allowed him to command attention and bend the lives of those around him. But Abigail had seen behind the mask. She remembered his cruelty, the small injustices that had piled upon each other like layers of dust, unnoticed by the elite, but seared into the memories of the servants. Tonight, those memories fueled her resolve. The first sip was taken, a toast of laughter and cheer filling the room. Abigail's pulse remained steady, her exterior betraying nothing. Around her, the guests reveled in the false security of the night, their conversations drifting between gossip, politics, and trivial amusements. Yet beneath the chandeliers and the orchestral music, the tension thickened like a storm waiting to break. Abigail retreated to a quiet corner where she could observe without attracting attention. She noted Charles's expressions, the slight smile that betrayed his self-satisfaction, the confident way he gestured with his glass. Each motion had been memorized, each routine timed to perfection. The poison, odorless and tasteless, would work swiftly, silently, and irrevocably. Moments passed, each stretching into an eternity. Abigail's thoughts turned to the other members of the Duval household. Eleanor, poised and elegant, floated among the guests with practiced grace, her awareness sharp but limited. She would soon witness events she could never have anticipated. The children, safely tucked away in their chambers, remained blissfully unaware, their innocence a stark contrast to the impending consequences. Outside, the Charleston night pressed against the windows, the fog wrapping the mansion in a ghostly veil. Inside, the music and laughter created a veneer of normalcy, masking the danger that had infiltrated every corner of the estate. Abigail's eyes darted to the clock again, 10 minutes to the decisive moment. She adjusted her position slightly, the decanter now within easy reach, her fingers brushing against it with the familiarity of years of preparation. The first signs of unease began to ripple through the room as Charles's face subtly shifted, a slight pallor, a sudden hesitation in his movements, small indicators that the poison was taking hold. Guests remained oblivious, their attention captured by the grandeur of the ball, the music, the flickering candlelight. Only Abigail remained, fully aware, her mind calculating each second, anticipating every reaction. A servant approached, offering another refill of wine. Abigail intercepted the tray with practiced grace, ensuring the decanter remained untouched by others. Every contingency had been considered, every potential threat neutralized. The room was a delicate balance of chaos and control, and Abigail held the scales firmly in her hands. Charles Duval's laughter faltered, a cough breaking the rhythm of his toast. He glanced around, confusion flickering in his eyes, but pride prevented him from showing fear. Eleanor noticed the change first, her instincts sharper than those of the other guests. "Charles?" she asked, concern lacing her voice. He waved her off, masking his growing unease with a forced smile. Abigail moved closer, appearing as though she were adjusting a tablecloth, but in truth, she was observing every subtle change in his posture, every twitch that betrayed the poison's progress. Time slowed in her perception. Every heartbeat, every whispered word, every glance around the room carried weight. The first shivers ran through Charles's body, unnoticed by the crowd but vividly apparent to Abigail. His hand shook slightly as he raised the glass again, act of drinking now perilous. A servant reached to assist him, but Abigail's intervention was smooth, natural, and unnoticed. The decanter was positioned perfectly, the poison's path secure. Outside, the fog thickened, wrapping the mansion in an ethereal cloak. Inside, the orchestra played on, the melodies creating an almost surreal contrast to the unfolding reality. Abigail's mind remained sharp, cataloging every reaction, every movement. She had anticipated this exact moment, had prepared for every variable, yet the human element, the unpredictability, added an intoxicating edge to her plan. Charles's face now showed the unmistakable signs of poisoning, dizziness, confusion, and a creeping panic that he tried desperately to hide. Guests began to notice murmurs rising in the opulent room. Eleanor stepped closer, her expression a mixture of concern and horror, yet she had no understanding of the true cause. Abigail, calm and composed, watched the scene unfold, every detail falling into place as she had envisioned. The room's tension escalated rapidly. Charles's legs weakened, and he grasped the edge of the table, attempting to steady himself. Guests whispered, some laughing nervously, others alarmed. The orchestra's music faltered momentarily, the illusion of celebration cracking under the weight of reality. Abigail's thoughts drifted momentarily to the larger implications of her actions. This night would be remembered, not for the grandeur of the ball, but for the collapse of a tyrant who had underestimated the quiet seamstress in his midst. Justice, delayed for years, had arrived in the most calculated and precise manner imaginable. As Charles stumbled, Eleanor caught him, her gasp loud enough to draw attention. "Charles, what is happening?" she cried. Panic rippled through the room, the grandeur now replaced by chaos. Abigail remained in the shadows, observing, ensuring her actions remained undetected while the consequences of her careful planning became fully apparent. And as Charles Duval collapsed, the room erupted. In alarm, Abigail felt the quiet satisfaction of months of preparation fulfilled. The invisible hand of the oppressed had struck with precision, and the balance of power had irrevocably shifted. The Duval mansion, once a symbol of untouchable authority, now stood witness to the repercussions of hubris, cruelty, and underestimation. The grand hall of the Duval mansion descended into chaos. Crystal chandeliers shook slightly as guests gasped and whispered, their laughter from mere moments ago replaced by disbelief and panic. Servants scurried in every direction, unsure whether to call for doctors, aid the stricken man, or flee from the suddenly menacing aura that had descended over the estate. Charles Duval clutched at Eleanor, his fingers pale and trembling. The wineglass fell from his grasp, shattering on the marble floor with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Abigail remained poised, standing near the edge of the ballroom, her face unreadable, her mind cataloging every reaction. She was not a participant in the hysteria, but a silent observer, a shadow witnessing the reckoning she had orchestrated. Guests hovered, murmuring questions to each other, their voices rising in anxious speculation. "What happened to him?" one whispered. "Was it the food? A sudden illness?" No one suspected the quiet seamstress, her actions hidden behind years of overlooked labor and unassuming presence. Eleanor's eyes widened in horror. She had spent decades under the dominance of her husband, and now she faced the fragility of the man she had once seen as invincible. Her gaze swept the room, seeking answers, yet only confusion met her. Abigail noted Eleanor's instinctive attempts to regain control, her authoritative posture momentarily unsteady. Even the matriarchs of Charleston society had no idea how deeply a servant's knowledge and observation could surpass their own assumptions. Outside, the fog thickened, as though the world itself conspired with the unfolding events. The distant carriage wheels on cobblestones echoed through the night, a reminder that the city beyond was unaware of the shocking drama within these walls. Inside, the mansion's grandeur clashed violently with the raw human vulnerability now exposed. Abigail's mind raced with contingencies. She had anticipated that Charles might struggle for breath, might call for help, or even accuse someone irrationally in his final moments. She had prepared explanations, misdirections, and timing sequences to maintain her invisibility. Tonight, every move required precision. One misstep could turn her carefully orchestrated plan into a catastrophe. As servants and guests gathered around Charles, Eleanor frantically summoned a physician from a nearby carriage. Abigail's gaze followed the new arrival, the doctor's, approach a variable she had anticipated but could not fully control. She noted the subtle changes in Charles's complexion, the pallor deepening, the beads of sweat forming on his forehead. Each sign confirmed the poison's efficacy, a grim testament to her preparation. The doctor, a portly man with spectacles perched precariously on his nose, examined Charles with urgency. "He's poisoned," he murmured under his breath. Though, the words were loud enough to reach nearby ears. Panic erupted anew. Guests questioned each other, some pointing fingers at the servants, others looking at each other with suspicion. Abigail's heart remained steady, her mind calculating the ripple effects of these accusations. The mansion itself seemed to react to the unfolding calamity. Candles flickered as drafts moved through the halls, doors creaked under invisible pressure, and shadows danced along the walls, giving the impression of an unseen hand orchestrating the chaos. Abigail felt a surge of grim satisfaction. The environment mirrored the upheaval she had unleashed within the human sphere. Eleanor knelt beside her husband, her voice trembling. Who could do this?" she asked, her eyes scanning the room, her suspicion yet to find its true target. Abigail remained in the periphery, careful to avoid the line of sight, her posture composed as though nothing unusual had occurred. Meanwhile, the whispers grew louder among the guests. Was it a rival family? A disgruntled worker? Could it be an accident? Each theory was plausible, yet none could fathom the quiet servant who had waited, watched, and struck when the time was right. Abigail knew she had rewritten the rules of power within the Duval household tonight. The invisible had become decisive. The oppressed had become the architect of change. Charles's breathing grew shallow, his strength fading with every passing minute. The physician attempted remedies, none effective. The social veneer of the ball, once immaculate and impenetrable, now lay in tatters. Abigail observed the unfolding drama, noting every subtle emotional shift, the terror in Eleanor's eyes, the growing suspicion among the guests, the panic-stricken glances of the remaining servants. Amidst the chaos, Abigail's thoughts drifted briefly to her own life, to the years of unnoticed toil, the slights, the injustices, the silent suffering that had shaped her resolve. Each memory fueled her calm determination, each recollection a reminder of why tonight mattered so profoundly. She was no longer a passive participant in her own story. She was an active agent, a force that demanded attention even if it remained hidden in plain sight. Outside, the fog pressed against the windows like a silent witness. Inside, the mansion's opulence clashed violently with the raw human drama, the glittering chandeliers casting reflections that seemed almost accusatory. Abigail's attention remained razor-sharp. She knew that the aftermath of her actions would ripple far beyond this room, beyond Charleston, beyond the Duval family itself. The doctor finally straightened, shaking his head. "There's nothing more I can do," he said, his voice a solemn echo that silenced the room. Charles Duval lay inert, his power, influence, and tyranny undone in a single calculated act. Gasps, cries, and whispers filled the space, a chorus of disbelief and dawning realization. Abigail's eyes softened briefly, acknowledging the gravity of what she had wrought. Yet even as chaos consumed the room, Abigail knew her story was far from over. The mansion, the city, the families, all would demand answers. Rumors would spread, accusations would fly, and the fragile balance of society would tremble under the weight of an invisible hand that had chosen to act. Her next moves would require equal cunning, equal patience, equal nerve. For now, she remained a silent witness to her own work, the quiet seamstress whose life of careful observation had culminated in a single, devastating moment. The Duval family, their legacy of cruelty and power, would never recover in quite the same way again. And in the shadows of the ballroom, Abigail prepared for what was coming next: the scrutiny, the suspicion, and the unexpected consequences of having finally turned the table. The morning after the fateful ball, the Duval mansion was a house divided, not by walls or rooms, but by suspicion, fear, and whispered theories. Word of Charles Duval's sudden death spread through Charleston like wildfire. The city, ever hungry for scandal, consumed every detail and invented even more. Abigail observed from the periphery, her hands folded neatly over her apron, her expression neutral, as though she were just another servant in a house now rife with chaos. Eleanor, draped in mourning black, summoned her most trusted advisors and family members. She paced the drawing room relentlessly, her mind grasping at fragments of explanation. It could not have been natural, she insisted. Someone must have done this. Whispers in the hallways suggested poison, a rival family, disgruntled, workers, and even the possibility of divine retribution. Abigail listened carefully, noting the angles of suspicion, the inconsistencies in every story told. She had planned for this. Every finger that pointed, every rumor that spread, became a variable she could manage, a tool she could manipulate to ensure her own invisibility. Outside the mansion, Charleston's elite began to speculate openly. Street corners buzzed with gossip, newspapers printed half-truths, and acquaintances of the Duvals whispered their own interpretations. The incident had sparked not just a tragedy, but a social earthquake. And Abigail, the quiet seamstress, remained an unseen force at the center. The mansion's staff, however, were not so easily ignored. Servants who had once moved silently through corridors now found themselves the targets of suspicion. Abigail observed the subtle dynamics shift. Eyes darted nervously, questions were asked under breath, and every minor slip, a delayed tray, a misfolded napkin, was magnified into evidence of wrongdoing. Eleanor demanded an inquiry. She summoned local authorities, eager to assign blame and restore a sense of order. Detectives arrived with notepads, quills, and a steady determination to unearth the truth. Abigail watched them from the shadows, calculating. Each question, asked, each theory proposed, was a thread she could tug or sever, ensuring the tapestry of deception remained intact. The investigators began their work with methodical thoroughness. They interviewed guests, scrutinized the food and drink served, and questioned every servant present. Abigail answered politely when called upon, offering only what was necessary, careful never to reveal more than a socially acceptable servant might. Her hands remained steady, her gaze calm, her voice measured. She knew the eyes that watched. Her might suspect, but could never prove the carefully hidden reality of her actions. Meanwhile, rumors spread beyond the mansion walls. Letters circulated in Charleston's social circles, recounting the shocking tale with embellishments that made the story even more terrifying. Abigail noted the effect of these rumors. Suspicion began to cast a shadow over the entire household. Guests and family members alike started to treat every servant with heightened scrutiny, questioning loyalty, competence, and honesty. One afternoon, Eleanor confronted Abigail directly. Her voice trembled with authority and fear. "Abigail, did you see anyone acting strangely last night?" she asked, eyes narrowing. Abigail smiled politely, a gesture of innocence perfectly timed. "I only saw the usual guests, ma'am," she replied, her tone steady, her demeanor calm. The simplicity of her answer deflected suspicion, while Eleanor's mind, desperate for clarity, accepted the surface truth. Yet not all suspicions were as easily managed. A young maid, curious and timid, had noticed Abigail moving near the wine decanter before the ball. The girl's unease grew each day, her nervous glances adding an unspoken threat. Abigail, aware of the observation, took subtle steps to redirect attention. A kind word here, a helpful gesture there, always reinforcing her role as the innocent, dutiful servant. Days turned into weeks. Charleston's elite debated, analyzed, and whispered. The investigation became a theater of performance, each character playing their role under scrutiny. Abigail moved through this theater like a shadow, silent yet observant, her every action designed to maintain the balance of deception. Meanwhile, Eleanor's grief began to transform into determination. She summoned lawyers, consulted with influential acquaintances, and began planning the restructuring of the household. Abigail's careful calculations ensured she remained indispensable. Her skills, her knowledge of the estate, and her unassuming presence made her a necessary participant in the new order, an invisible yet central figure. But the greatest threat came not from suspicion or investigation, but from Abigail's own conscience. Each day she confronted the reality of her actions. The man she had poisoned, the life she had changed, the delicate web she had woven, all demanded mental precision, a balance between moral reflection and calculated survival. Even as she maintained her outward calm, Abigail prepared for every eventuality. Letters might be intercepted, a servant might speak too freely, an investigator might grow too curious. Every potential exposure was met with contingency plans, alibis, diversions, subtle manipulations, and the careful placement of truth against falsehood. The mansion, once a symbol of untouchable wealth and authority, had become a battleground of observation, deception, and subtle maneuvering. Abigail's quiet brilliance lay not in the act itself, but in the careful orchestration of every reaction afterward. Her story was no longer simply about revenge. It was about survival, invisibility, and the art of controlling events from the shadows. As Charleston watched, whispered, and speculated, Abigail continued her careful dance, every step measured, every gesture intentional. The city's gaze may have been intense, the investigation relentless, but the seamstress remained unseen, untouchable, and in command of the narrative she had created. And in the quiet moments when no one watched, she allowed herself a fleeting thought: the world had never truly known the power of the overlooked, the underestimated, or the quietly patient. Tonight, tomorrow, and the days beyond, she would continue to navigate the storm she had conjured, careful, precise, and unbroken. Weeks passed since the fateful ball, yet the echoes of Charles Duval's death lingered like a heavy fog over the Duval mansion. The city of Charleston whispered in hushed tones. Speculation simmered in parlors and streets alike, and the investigation showed no signs of slowing. Abigail, the unassuming seamstress, moved through the household with quiet precision, her every gesture calculated to maintain her invisibility. Even as the official inquiry continued, rumors spread faster than facts. Servants whispered to one another, and letters carried embellishments to distant friends and relatives. Some claimed that Charles's death had been the result of a family feud. Others hinted at dark sorcery or secret poisonings. Abigail's subtle genius was that she allowed these rumors to exist, unopposed, unchecked, so the attention would fracture in 1,000 directions, leaving her unscathed. Yet threats were growing closer, not just from idle gossip, but from men with authority, tasked with uncovering the truth. Detectives, persistent and increasingly frustrated, scoured the mansion, examining every servant, every tray, every shadow. Abigail answered questions politely, providing only the necessary details, careful never to overcommit or expose her hidden knowledge. Her calm demeanor was her armor, her silence a shield against suspicion. The tension within the mansion became palpable. Eleanor, still mourning, oscillated between grief and suspicion. She questioned everyone, observed every movement, and consulted advisors relentlessly. Abigail noted these patterns, recognizing that Eleanor's grief made her both vulnerable and unpredictable. A wrong word, a gesture misinterpreted, and suspicion could fall upon anyone. One afternoon, a new figure arrived at the mansion, a young lawyer sent by Eleanor's relatives to oversee the estate's affairs. He was methodical, calculating, and suspicious by nature. Abigail watched him from the corner of her eye, noting the sharpness in his gaze and the careful way he questioned the staff. Every question was a test, every observation a potential threat. Abigail moved with deliberate grace, deflecting attention with subtle charm and carefully placed words. But the greatest danger was not the men of law or the whispers of the city. It was human curiosity, and the unpredictability of servants themselves. A young cook, curious and innocent, had begun to piece together fragments of the evening. Her observations, though naive, threatened to unravel the delicate web Abigail had woven. The seamstress responded with calculated kindness, a reassuring smile, guidance on chores, small compliments, all designed to divert suspicion and reinforce her image as a loyal, inconspicuous servant. As days turned into weeks, the mansion became a stage of silent tension. Abigail observed the movements of the household, which doors were locked, which rooms were watched, which servants were under scrutiny. She memorized every pattern, every routine, every subtle behavior, knowing that her survival depended on foresight and precision. Meanwhile, outside the mansion, the city continued to buzz. Newspapers published speculative accounts of Charles Duval's death, each article more sensational than the last. Abigail noticed the public's fascination and understood its value. By feeding the fire of curiosity, the truth would become obscured in layers of rumor and conjecture. She had orchestrated more than a simple act of revenge. She had created a narrative in which she could hide, move, and survive. Tension escalated further when a distant relative of the Duvals arrived in Charleston, determined to claim a stake in the estate and investigate the suspicious circumstances surrounding Charles's death. This relative, sharp and relentless, began asking pointed questions, scrutinizing the staff and demanding full accounts of every action taken during the fateful night. Abigail responded with patience and composure, offering plausible explanations and deflecting attention with subtle misdirection. The mansion itself seemed to respond to the tension. Doors creaked at inopportune moments, shadows lingered in corners, and the soft hum of Charleston streets outside the walls reminded everyone of the world beyond. Abigail moved through these spaces like a phantom, her presence known yet unnoticed, her mind calculating each risk and opportunity. As the investigation intensified, Abigail also navigated personal threats. A distant cousin of the deceased, once friendly with the household staff, began to show unusual interest in Abigail's routines. His attention, though polite on the surface, carried an edge of suspicion, a subtle interrogation hidden beneath casual conversation. Abigail, aware of the potential danger, maintained her innocence while planting small seeds of misdirection, false trails that drew attention away from her. At night, Abigail's mind often drifted to the act itself, the careful preparation, the precise timing, the subtle poison that had sealed Charles Duval's fate. But she did not dwell in pride. Instead, she reflected on survival, on the delicate balance between secrecy and exposure. Each night, she planned the next day's moves, ensuring that every gesture, every word, every glance maintained the equilibrium she had so carefully constructed. Meanwhile, tensions within the household reached a boiling point. Eleanor's grief and frustration transformed into anger, and she began to lash out at both servants and family members. Abigail observed these shifts, noting who was vulnerable, who was easily manipulated, and who might become a threat. Every interaction became a chess move, each step forward measured, each retreat calculated. In this climate of suspicion and tension, Abigail's mastery lay in patience. She understood that time was her ally. Investigators would tire, curiosity would fade, and public attention would shift. By maintaining composure and invisibility, she ensured that her role in the events remained hidden, even as the world around her descended into chaos. Yet even as she moved through the household with quiet control, Abigail knew that one misstep could destroy everything. A careless word, an overlooked observation, or a moment of human error could unravel the careful tapestry of secrecy she had woven. She prepared for these possibilities, planning contingencies, creating alibis, and anticipating every conceivable challenge. The mansion became a place of strategic maneuvering, a stage where every action mattered. Abigail's brilliance lay not in what she had done, but in how she continued to navigate the aftermath. Every day was a test of nerves, a challenge of perception, and a dance with danger that required both subtlety and intelligence. And through it all, Abigail remained the quiet seamstress, the invisible force at the center of a storm, unseen, underestimated, and in control. She knew the investigation, the rumors, and the subtle threats were not permanent. With patience, cunning, and careful planning, she could weather every challenge, maintain her freedom, and remain untouchable. The night had grown thick and heavy over the plantation. Candles flickered in the grand ballroom where the ball continued, unaware of the storm brewing in the shadows. Abigail moved with calculated steps, her apron hidden beneath the layers of her gown. The small vial of poison nestled safely in her hand. Every guest was laughing, dancing, drinking, oblivious to the plan unfolding beneath their feet. She recalled the whispers of the servants, tales carried from kitchen to kitchen about the cruel methods of the plantation owner. Every lie he had told, every harsh punishment inflicted, every family broken. Abigail had memorized them all. The anger simmered inside her like molten metal, steady, hot, ready to be poured. At the far end of the room, the plantation owner stood surrounded by men in polished boots, their voices mixing with the strains of violins. He laughed, raising a glass, unaware that the fate he had always controlled was now slipping from his grasp. Abigail adjusted her gloves, pretending to tidy a nearby table, her hands brushing over the silverware, ensuring the target cup, the one that would seal the evening, was in place. Her mind wandered briefly to the stories she had heard as a child. Tales of slaves who resisted quietly, their vengeance hidden, their justice slow but inevitable. Abigail had grown up learning the art of patience, how to listen when others spoke, how to see when others were blind. And tonight, she would become part of that lineage, invisible yet unstoppable. The owner's laughter cut through the air. He toasted to the prosperity of his lands, to the wealth and power he wielded, blind to the storm brewing around him. Abigail felt her heartbeat slow, a strange calm settling over her. She was ready. Every step, every breath, every small movement had led to this moment. She approached the table casually, placing a fresh decanter of wine before him. He smiled, unaware, and reached for the glass she had prepared. Abigail watched as he lifted it, swirling it gently, and then sipped. The reaction was subtle at first, an almost imperceptible cough, but then his eyes widened in shock and his knees buckled. Gasps rose from the crowd. Abigail stepped back into the shadows, her face calm, almost serene. The chaos that followed was both horrifying and precise. Servants screamed, guests scattered, and the owner clutched his chest, collapsing in a heap. Yet amidst the turmoil, Abigail's movements remained deliberate. She guided the frightened, protected those who could be harmed in the confusion, all while keeping the attention away from herself. She became part of the chaos without being touched by it. Outside the ballroom, the night air was cold against her skin. Abigail paused, catching her breath, listening to the distant shouts and footsteps inside. Every sound was a confirmation, a proof that the plan had succeeded. Yet her mind was already moving forward, thinking of escape, thinking of survival, thinking of the legacy she would leave behind. As the first hints of dawn began to brush the horizon, Abigail made her way quietly to the servants' quarters, blending into the shadows unnoticed and unclaimed by the chaos she had sown. Her eyes scanned the familiar halls, remembering the faces of those she had helped, the silent allies who had waited with her, each one a part of the plan. And in that moment, standing in the cool morning air, she felt a mix of triumph and sorrow. The deed was done, but the weight of it settled on her shoulders. Lives had ended, and while justice had been served, the human cost was undeniable. Abigail whispered a small prayer for the souls lost and the future she now held in her hands. She vanished into the misty morning, leaving behind a house forever changed, a ball that would be remembered not for music or wine, but for the silent storm that had passed through its doors. The dawn broke slowly over the plantation, painting the sky with bruised purples and fiery oranges, as if the heavens themselves had watched the night's violence and could not rest. Abigail moved silently through the grounds, her gown whispering against the dew-laden grass. The mansion loomed behind her, a silent monument to cruelty now shaken to its core. She had done what needed to be done, yet the weight of what she carried pressed upon her chest like a stone. Inside, the aftermath of the ball was chaos. Guests whispered frantic accusations, servants hid behind doors, and the body of the plantation owner lay still, a grim testament to Abigail's careful planning. Rumors would spread fast, whispers of poison, of dark intentions of the housemaid who dared defy the master. Abigail's name would travel, whispered in fear and awe, yet few would truly know the depth of her courage or her pain. Her mind drifted back to the days before, to the small injustices piled high, the endless nights of labor, the whispered threats, the stolen dreams of freedom. Every insult, every cruelty, every broken promise had led her here. She remembered the faces of those she had silently protected, the children who had slept safely because she had been vigilant, the fellow servants whose whispers had guided her hand. She was not merely a survivor, she had become a reckoning. As she stepped into the small woods at the edge of the plantation, Abigail paused, listening. The birds were cautious, the wind hushed, as if even nature acknowledged the weight of the night. She allowed herself a single moment of reflection. The world was different now, not just because of what she had done, but because she had dared to act when so many were too afraid. Questions rose in her mind, lingering like ghosts. Would justice ever truly follow, or would others twist the story to fit their own narratives? Would the legacy of the master be rewritten, or would her act be buried beneath gossip and fear? These were questions she could not answer, but she carried them with the same precision she had carried her plan, knowing that life's mysteries often lingered unanswered. The journey away from the plantation was quiet, deliberate. Abigail moved through fields still slick with morning dew, past the river that had reflected so many stolen dreams, and into the winding roads that led to unknown freedom. She had no map, no guide, only the knowledge that she must disappear, that she must live to tell a story that could not yet be told. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over the land, Abigail paused at a hilltop, looking back at the plantation one last time. It was a place of wealth, power, and terror, but now it was a place forever marked by courage, by defiance, by a single soul who refused to bend under oppression. She whispered a final vow into the wind, a vow that her actions would not be forgotten, that the oppressed would have their stories, that justice, however delayed, would find its way. Her path led her into towns and forests, each step away from the plantation a step toward life reclaimed. Along the way, she encountered people who had suffered similar cruelties, people who recognized her resolve and quietly offered aid, shelter, and guidance. Every encounter reinforced the truth Abigail had always known. Courage inspired courage, and one act of defiance could ripple far beyond the place it began. And yet, even as she moved through freedom, shadows of the past lingered. Faces of those lost, of those she had protected, of the life she had left behind haunted her quietly, like whispers in the wind. Abigail carried them with her, not as chains, but as reminders of why she had acted, of the cost of silence and of the power of choice. Months later, in a small hidden town far from Savannah, Abigail found herself among people who would never know the full story. She worked quietly, sewing, cooking, tending to those in need, all while her name faded from newspapers but grew in legend. Stories whispered in kitchens, carried along roads, passed from one survivor to another. Abigail, the seamstress who had turned the table, the housemaid who had struck a master down, the shadow who carried justice with her hands. The world outside continued, ignorant of the full truth. Yet within hearts that had witnessed cruelty, Abigail became a symbol, a spark of hope. Even in the darkest hours, one person's courage could ignite change, could challenge fear, could rewrite what was thought immutable. Finally, standing at the edge of a quiet river, Abigail gazed at her reflection in the rippling water. The face staring back was marked by trials, by sorrow, by triumph. She allowed herself a faint smile, a recognition that her journey was far from over, yet she had already shaped history in ways others could not erase. And as the wind swept through, The trees carrying the faint scent of the plantation she had left behind, Abigail whispered softly to herself, a vow carried in the current. Justice remembers, and I will too. The story of Abigail Carter would not end with the ball, the poison, or the plantation owner's fall. It would live on in whispers, in courage, in the quiet moments when the oppressed found their voice. It would remind all who listened that, even in the face of cruelty, even under the weight of injustice, defiance and hope could persist. And now, as you've traveled this story with me, take a moment to reflect. What would you do in the face of injustice? Could you stand when the world expects silence? Share your thoughts below. Let this story inspire a conversation, and don't forget to subscribe to join us for more tales that uncover the hidden truths of history. Because history, as dark as it can be, also holds the light of those who dared to rise. And Abigail Carter is proof that even one person can change everything.